Welcome to the Determined Truth Podcast.
Want the truth? You can't handle the truth.
Where we aim to explore questions of truth, the scriptures, and what it means for the church today. Here are your hosts, Rob Dalrymple and Vinny Angelo.
Hey everyone, welcome in. We're continuing through our study in Revelation, and today it's the most different type of show we've done.
The most differentest.
The most differenter of the things. I'm good at words. I went to seminary.
You're reading Dr. Seuss to Mateo is what you're doing.
This is actually so true.
That's the best time, dude.
It is. Oh, it's fun. It's fun.
It's the best time. I wish Mateo over here.
Funny.
I'll read him. When I come to California in a few weeks, give me some Dr. Seuss, and Mateo and I will sit down for a little while.
Creepy Uncle Rob was going to read to you, buddy. Funny though. So we just spent 2 weeks in Portugal. We were in the Azore Islands for a week and a half of it. Yeah. And Mateo turned 7 when we were over there. And he woke up and he's, Dad, my voice isn't any different, and I don't think I'm any taller. He was very confused for 7-year-old. It was hilarious.
That actually fits into today's conversation a little bit.
It does actually. So in today's conversation, we are going to have a guest on. It's someone who has an advanced degree. He's going to talk about theology, but he is not a theologian in any kind of way. He's a psychologist.
Yeah.
How did you come across Dan Koch?
Through Danny. And so we're going to bring Danny on here shortly as well. Danny knows him from way back. They'll discuss that, I think, on the podcast itself. And so then I started listening to some of Dan's podcasts because Danny told me about him a little bit. And I'm like, hey, this guy's experience, he's going to talk about trauma from his end times paranoia upbringing. He was raised in the 90s or whatever. I think he said he was born 1983. And he's going to talk about the end times paranoia of, oh no, what am I going to do? Am I going to die and go to hell? Or has the world ended? And how that caused him trauma. And I think that's something that we need to understand, that sometimes our theology may actually cause trauma when we don't go about things the right way.
Yeah. And so the point of the conversation, unlike when we've had other guests on, we're not getting into a theological topic today. That we're not exploring that. We're exploring more the traumatic type of things and the impacts that theology can have.
Yeah. James 3, don't presume to be teaching my brothers. Yeah, because you who teach will be judged more strictly. There's a responsibility we have in teaching and parenting and leading or whatever. And there's implications sometimes to our theology that we don't think about.
Yeah. Okay. Very good. So there's a couple terms that are brought up here. Yep. One of them is a central part of the conversation. We've defined these before, but let's define them real quickly.
Sure.
So the conversation definitely surrounds the idea of dispensational premillennialism. And that's a schema of thought on how many people interpret Revelation and end times type stuff. We've talked about it a lot before. Are there ways that you would want to say, hey, these are the nuggets of what premillennial dispensationalism is?
Yeah. The first thing I would do is I would distinguish dispensationalism and premillennialism.
Okay. They're not the same.
They don't have to be the same. Not all premillennialists are dispensationalists, but basically all dispensationalists are premillennialists.
The other side of that is you could have what's called a historic premillennial.
Correct.
And a historic premillennialist is not going to be dispensational. They're going to be covenantal in terms of how they see the storyline of the Bible playing out and how the covenants connect together and that sort of thing. That's different than dispensationalism.
Yeah. So maybe we'll start with premillennialism because we discussed that a number of times when we did Revelation chapter 20. Premillennialism is simply the idea that Jesus comes back before the millennium. They're taking the millennium in a somewhat literal, but not necessarily literal context. It says Jesus returns, and then he actually reigns from Jerusalem for 1,000 years. And it may or may not be a literal 1,000-year time frame, but there's a literal reign of Christ on the earth. So the idea typically will be like there's a silver age and the gold age and the new creation. So the silver age is where we're at now. We have the Holy Spirit. The gold age is where Christ comes back and reigns from Jerusalem. And then the new creation is at the end of that 1,000 years when heaven and earth become one and there's the final judgment. So that's premillennialism. The Christ returns before the 1,000 years, and his return begins a quote unquote literal 1,000-year period of time. Premillennialism actually goes back to the historic Christian church. And I think you can make an argument that premillennialism was the view in the earliest Christian church, maybe even before amillennialism took hold during the time of Constantine and later on. So that's a common argument for premillennialists, is that this is actually the historic view of the church. And certainly by the late second century, it has a foothold. Dispensationalism, I'm sorry, it's 105 out here right now, so my voice is going bad, and I'm running low on water, so I should pause the episode and go get some water. But Dispensationalism comes in about the beginning of the 1800s. We usually associate it with a man named John Nelson Darby, though he actually had a man named Edward Irvin, who a good friend of mine did his dissertation on Edward Irvin, and Darby stole all of his stuff from Edward Irvin, by the way. So he wasn't the originator of it. But anyways, it's an idea that God speaks to humanity over the course of time in these dispensations or eras. There's the era of Moses and the law. Then there's the era of grace where the present day church is. And then there'll be the era of the millennium. So it's dispensationalism. And there's often 7 dispensations. And the idea that people get saved differently in each dispensation. So at the time of Moses, they got saved by following the law. At the dispensation of Jesus or the church age, they get saved by faith in Christ. And there's often, by the way, a disassociation from the law, because we're saved by grace through Christ, and that means the laws for another dispensation. In fact, Darby Scofield, the famous Scofield Reference Bible, actually said initially that the Sermon on the Mount was for the Jewish people before Jesus. But when they rejected Jesus, Jesus said, okay, let me turn this direction. Instead of going with the Sermon on the Mount, we'll go with salvation by grace through faith. So it's that kind of that radical reading. It then came to dispensationalism, then became strong in the mid-1900s, 1970s, 80s, and 90s, and associated with fundamentalism and evangelicalism or the literalism, that the Bible is to be understood literally, and therefore Israel becoming a nation, 1948. That's a sign of the millennial dispensation coming about, of the end times. So it has a lot of end times fervor, is what it might mean for you and me and for our generation. The world's going to end, 7-year tribulation, literal Antichrist, a literal war in the Battle of Megiddo. Armageddon's a literal battle fought between Russia and the Israel, stuff like that. And things that we've discussed. So Jace Broadhurst and I did a live stream on Ezekiel a couple months ago. You can find on the YouTube channel. You and I have done a number of videos on that. Obviously, my book, Understanding the New Testament and the End Times, addresses this, and we have a lot of resources on it. So what would you add?
No, from a popular standpoint, I would just say this is the dominant view that you heard about, whether you were in the church or not. If you grew up in the 60s, 70s, 80s, 90s, maybe a later part of the 60s, but definitely in mid 70s, late 70s, 80s, 90s, this is what you think about when you think of end times. You think of cataclysmic things. The apocalypse is a bad word. It's this terrible, awful thing that's going to happen where everything is going to be destroyed and people are going to be raptured. And this is where video games and movies are sensationalized. So this is the popular view in America. By popular, we mean this is what the populace believe. This is not what the majority of scholars believe or have believed.
This is the Simla Hay Left Behind series also, right? We should mention, which I never read because I'm ADD and I knew I had no chance of being able to follow what the books were about anyway. So I never read them. So thank God.
Exactly. So it's any type of thinking on that end of the spectrum. So that's dispensationalism. He also mentions amillennialism, which we've talked about, I believe, before on that Revelation 20 podcast. And it's just a view that says, hey, the millennium isn't limited by 1,000 years. It's probably an indefinite or open period of time that's
present.
And it's present, yes.
Because the Holy Spirit reigns through the hearts of believers. So Christ is reigning now through believers. That's right.
I was going to say, go back and listen to the Revelation 20 series we did. That we'll talk about that stuff.
We did 3 episodes on, and I do discuss this in my commentary, but my book, Understanding the New Testament and the End Times, I didn't address the millennium at all because I really often just simply don't care enough because people use it as a litmus test. If you hold my view of the millennium, then I'll listen to what you have to say. And I just didn't want to do that. And the reality is I just don't think it matters when it comes to following Jesus faithfully nowadays. Of course, end times paranoia stuff like the world is evil and everybody's bad and this war is going to end and the return of Jesus, so that we're excited. That stuff I have a problem with, and I think that's important. But
speaking of, I was in Portugal. I ordered a book. It came in the day I got home. It's a new commentary on Revelation. You should pick it up. Yes, it's by this guy Robert Dalrymple. You may have heard of him.
Rob.
No, Roberto.
It doesn't say Robert. This is Rob.
It should say that.
And you're supposed to struggle to say the last name. Dalrymple.
Anyway, congratulations.
Thank you.
That's a big deal, man.
I actually haven't gotten my copies yet. I did get the Kindle version, which I had to buy myself.
Nice. So anyway, congratulations on the book.
Thank you.
Folks should definitely pick it up. It is a good companion piece with the podcast that we did. But yeah, man, congratulations on that. Forward by Scott McKnight, our friend. So that's awesome. He's a big deal. Hey, Danny Hall, we've mentioned him before, and that's how we got introduced to Dan. You've had live streams with Danny. Many of you guys know who Danny Hall is from the live stream. If not, you could catch him on those because you guys have done a lot of them there. But he's jumping into this conversation as well because he knows Dan, and he'll introduce Dan to us all. So without further ado, here we go. Danny, tell us who we're talking to today.
We're glad to have with us today Dan Koch. I've known Dan since he was in high school. He went to high school with my son, and I enjoyed watching him develop his professional life in these last few years. Dan is a licensed therapist in the state of Washington, lives outside of Seattle and Bellingham now, and is the host of the You Have Permission podcast. So Dan, thank you so much for joining us today. We're glad to have you. And
happy to be here.
One of the things that, Dan, a few years back, you actually interviewed me on one of your podcasts because you've been doing a lot of research related to end times teaching. And I was one of some folks that go so far back to the Hal Lindsey days and where our own evolution of thought on that. But as part of some general research that's based on your own experience, so today we just want to hear you talk about the end times theology, how you experienced it growing up, and some of its impact on that, on you and on your research.
Danny, I'm an open book, man. I'll tell you whatever you want to hear. But yes, so it ended up, my official research has ended up being in spiritual abuse because when I went to do careful academic research on end times teachings and the possible effects of those, I came up against the realization that there was not even enough groundwork on the larger issues like spiritual abuse, which sort of were necessary to get at the specifics of those eschatological fears and all of that stuff. What I ended up with is a scale that measures exposure to potentially spiritually abusive experiences. And one of the subscales, one of the types of spiritual abuse includes things about end times, end of the world, visions being given to children at a developmentally inappropriate age. So I ended up getting to it as one part of this kind of larger, more basic project because of just the state of the research, which is, not very developed still.
Hey, Dan, I'm curious because I don't think we've talked about spiritual abuse on the podcast, and I'd love to know your definition. This is a topic that I've been studying a lot about in terms of the church world at large the last couple of years. And so I'm curious how you define spiritual abuse, and is this your own definition, or maybe how you've gleaned, or maybe what are the sources that you pull from that you find helpful on that topic?
Yeah, you can let me know if you want. I can pull up the actual careful definition that I have published, but basically it's a form of emotional and psychological abuse. So that's the first part, which means, let's say you are sexually abused by a member of the clergy, then we would expect you to have some of the effects that other people who are sexually abused have, regardless of whether that perpetrator was a clergy or not. And then we'd also expect you to have the kinds of effects that happen when someone is spiritually abused, because it was a clergy person. It wasn't just your uncle or whatever. It was like a person who represents God, represents religion. And so spiritual abuse is often involving some sort of power or control, not always. It can come from congregants and not just leaders, but it's basically a form of emotional and psychological abuse that affects someone's ability to practice their faith. And it takes place, what makes it spiritual abuse and not other just straight up emotional abuse is that it takes place in a religious environment and or with some sort of religious or spiritual content. Somebody physically abusing their child, that's child abuse. If they're quoting the Bible while they do it, then that's also spiritual abuse.
I was going to say, can you give us some examples, without maybe being too explicit if you don't want to, of spiritual abuse in the church?
Hey everyone, we want to thank you for joining us on today's podcast. And we want to remind you that everything we provide at Determined Truth is free of charge. And this even includes all of the teaching that Rob does on a weekly basis to pastors in India and around the world. We don't have any supporters that get special behind the scenes access. But we can only do this with the generous support that comes from those of you who can afford to give. So if you would prayerfully consider supporting us with anything from $5 a month or more, we will continue to work hard to challenge the church to be the church. To give, go to determinedtruth.com and click on the Give tab, or follow the link in the show notes.
Yeah, so you got stuff coming from leaders. So you might have a leader who goes beyond, I've been called by God to shepherd this flock, and a leader who begins to say things like, I speak directly for God, to either imply or explicitly claim that. You've got stuff that's more in the kind of victim blaming, gaslighting sort of situation. So think of any number of victims and survivors of any of these church scandals, the various times that they have all attempted to come forward before finally a reporter broke the story or something like that, where people had to take it seriously. They would be shunned, victim blamed, made to feel like they're the crazy one. You've got discrimination of all kinds. This one is a little tricky because there are legitimate theological disagreements about the role of women, and there are disagreements about sexuality, but people can be discriminated in a church setting for gender, race, sexual orientation, things like this. And if they are, well then, newsflash, they're going to be a lot less likely to engage with their faith moving forward. Things like that. And then, you know, the one that the end time stuff falls under, the type of abuse, is actually, I called it embracing violence, because it's this set of items that the statistical analysis clumped together. So if people said yes to one of them, they were more likely to say yes to the others. That's how we come up with subscales. And that one is, to me, one of the most interesting sort of areas that the research touches on, which is basically, it's this view of the world that says God has routinely used violence. And we see this in the text, and maybe we see it in the stories that we tell in our church or in our denomination or whatever. And therefore, we embrace a way of being in the world that includes a fair bit of violence. And that's not something to be shied away from. That's actually that's a part of God's plan. So you have items like Scripture being used to justify violence or being used to justify abusive parent-child behavior. You've got stuff like when kids are too young, scaring them with hell, scaring them with the end of the world. And then the last item there is just using terror or horror to motivate religious decisions. Obviously, there are like entire forms of American Protestantism almost built on the back of that last item, with all the hell houses and constant questions of, do you know where you'll go when you die, and that kind of thing, which has a real sort of cultural acceptance, but I would argue is potentially abusive and harmful.
Just to clarify real quick, Dan, you kept referring to a scale. You were actually the author of a scale called the Spiritual Harm and Abuse Scale, correct?
Correct, yeah.
And that's now been published in the Journal for the Scientific Study of Religion. Just so everybody knows, this is,
nice.
When he talks about the scale, this is an actual piece of a tool that you created, correct?
Yeah, and it's being translated, I think, in a couple different countries in different contexts, and starting to get used in other forms of research to check against other things that people are measuring. And yes, it's cool. It's cool to be on the ground floor with a handful of other researchers. I'm certainly not the leading voice or anything like that. Maybe a group of 10 of us or something who have published significant work in this world.
You're doing all this at the scholarly and research level, so I'm assuming it has not made its way to the popular level?
There is a free version of the screener that clinicians are using, but it's not like, I haven't like written a big book about it or anything. So it's like people who know and maybe tell each other, and I get emails from individual therapists every couple weeks about using it, or researchers who want to use it, or students who want to use it as part of their own dissertation. But it's still definitely in that kind of smaller, like, academic sphere for now.
Hey, Dan, let's step back for a second if we can, and just simply give us a foundation, like your own story, how you grew up in terms of this end times world. I think all of us on the call here have a dispensational background, but tell us a little bit of your story.
Yeah, so I grew up what I call moderate California evangelical. Danny's nodding his head. He escaped Atlanta to participate in this particular form of evangelicalism at a different church, but I would say almost like a sister church of mine growing up. And my dad was a therapist, and so I was spared some of the most like anti-science, anti-intellectual forms of evangelical Protestantism, but still in that milieu, and went to a junior high and high school that was connected to Young Life, went to what was actually an interdenominational church in Saratoga, California, So predated the non-denominational boom. A bunch of mainline kind of struggling churches had gotten together in the late 1800s or early 1900s and hired this architect to build them a chapel, and they consolidated. So it sounds like a bank, Saratoga Federated Church. But there are a handful of, apparently there are a handful of these. And it's an interesting lesson, actually, for the declining mainline, I think, today. I think more churches could probably go about federating themselves. And I understand the problems that those denominations face with all the retirement funds of their ministers and, all the complexity there. But anyway, it was, by the time I was growing up in it, born in 83, so aware of things in the 90s, it had become a pretty standard American non-denominational evangelical thing with a little bit of mainline flavor, some hymns, classics, early morning service for people who wanted that, pretty high caliber of music, and pretty populist, kind of normal for the time preaching. And it was actually, my church was significantly healthier than the schools that I was a part of, which were much more of a mixed bag. As we were talking about earlier, I had some incredible teachers in those schools, but also people that stuff that I don't even think would pass today in an evangelical school context. But hard to say. The culture war has changed a lot of. Culture war has stretched a lot of what people deem acceptable. But in 6th grade, somebody handed me a book, and it was a riff on that very popular 1988 pamphlet, 88 Reasons Why Christ Will Return in 1988 or whatever it was called. Yep. This one was about 94, 94 or 95. I always forget which year it was. And it was like a little paperback. It must have been cheaply published by some ministry or something, and I've not been able to track it down. But it was arguing for September of that year, and this was April of that year that I received this book. And I was 11 years old, and I was a very earnest kid. I had already had a history of panic disorder, what I would now call panic disorder. So pretty tough panic attacks and a lot of anxiety trying to avoid panic attacks that had started about 3 years prior and was not religiously oriented. They were about things like thunder and lightning and more kid stuff. But that changed when I was 11, and those began to be about signs of the Antichrist or wars and rumors of wars or whatever. And I have all these memories. Some of them are a little bit funny now because I was still prepubescent. So I have a distinct memory laying in my bed praying, God, don't let Jesus come back until I'm not going to do anything. I know I won't. I'm not going to commit any immorality, but I just want to be naked in a bed with a woman. And if that could please happen before before this all wraps up, I'm not going to sin. I know. And I didn't really want to. I didn't have the hormones yet, so it's easy for me to say I won't sin. But that kind of a thing. I was imagining my life being over. I was imagining I had 5 months to live, essentially.
Wow.
And basically telling an 11-year-old that they're going to die in 5 months, that's abusive. There's not a better word I have than abusive. I don't care what your theology says.
Yep.
You could be wrong. And then when you are wrong, you just hurt someone.
Yep.
So how did it develop beyond that? Because I know you often reference the Left Behind books and things like that in some of our conversations before.
Yeah, so Left Behind was absolutely ubiquitous in that world. My mom read, I think, probably 3 of the books, and I read 1.5 of them maybe. At that point, it is what I would now call panic research. I was like reading them to calm myself down, which of course didn't work. And just, it was everywhere. I mean, it was the dominant assumption of everybody in my life, or almost everybody in my life, that any day now, Jesus would return visibly in the clouds, and the good ones would be taken, and the other ones would be stuck. And I did have a lot of those, where did everybody go? Did I not get raptured and everybody else did? I think that's now almost like it's the center item on the bingo card. It's the free square. If you talk to someone who grew up in this world and they haven't had that experience, then are you a plant? Did you really Are you lying? Are you doing some sort of deep undercover work? Because if you didn't think that everybody else was raptured, I'm not sure you. So I had those experiences, but mostly for me, I didn't fear for my salvation. I have apparently a healthy ego around that stuff, and that wasn't the issue, but it was more about my life ending too soon. I've come to realize that's what it was for me. It was, I'm not going to get to live out this full, I'm not going to get my 10 was the language from the Noah story. And that even today, even these days, if I have a health scare or if I have something that sort of makes me think about that really, it bums me out. It makes me anxious because I want to have grandkids and have the whole life cycle. But yeah, it was just Left Behind it was everywhere. It was in the water.
I'm curious, and I need to find a way to ask this question because as someone who also struggles with general anxiety disorder, been in therapy for years, worked through it, the health stuff is definitely, let's just say I'm on a first name basis with my doctor. We're buddies. Yeah. Hypochondria is a real thing. Do you think when you look at the order of things, could it be that people who are maybe more prone to a general anxiety disorder might react negatively to this sort of theological belief? Or do you think it's the genesis of this belief then can create that? And I know it's going to be different for everyone. Do you have any thoughts on maybe the order of operations there?
My sense is that the theology is downstream from psychology and biology, frankly. The anxiety is a biopsycho reality, right? It's about our adrenaline system, and I've noticed this 100 times in my own experience, moments where actually I did something that made my body react and get up, and in an excitatory state. Could be I thought I got a decaf double espresso and they accidentally made it regular. It could be whatever, something happens in my body, and then my mind catches up and finds something to be anxious about. That's happened to me many times. You can, of course, go the other way. You can have the anxious thought, or you can have the trigger, and then that kicks your body into gear. So that's the more traditional way that we think of it, right? Like a panic trigger or something like that. But so I think that generally it's not dissimilar to PTSD. You can have two soldiers standing side by side. They witness the exact same atrocity. Yeah. One comes back with PTSD and one doesn't.
Right.
And their psychologists in the armed forces are trying to figure out how to predict that stuff to reduce the incidence of PTSD among soldiers before they go into the field. But they're aware of it. They're aware of these sort of just dispositional differences between individuals. And I would say that explains most of the variance and the variety of people's experiences with commonly taught or held specific teachings. So I would definitely lean a lot more toward it's who we are going in, and then we are interacting with whatever that item is that somebody is presenting us with.
And that's just interesting too. If you do land, it's a spectrum of thought in terms of where people are at, especially if you're listening to this and you happen to be a small group leader, a pastor, if you're on that leadership side of the equation. How we present information is very important, because you can't assume where your audience is at. Right. And just because I know so many people who just don't struggle with anxiety at all, when I've tried to have those conversations with them, they could be the dog head tilt like thing, like it just does not compute for them. And so they could talk about a subject like this just very nonchalantly, and it's not going to be a thing. And it's just knowing that not everyone, just like not everyone, you might be an auditory learner, someone else might be a visual learner, someone else is kinesthetic. And we tend to teach the way that we are. In the same way, we have to take into account they could get triggered by something that we just might seem as so mundane, and you can't just go and pull the carpet out from people. We need to have a lot of compassion on how we talk about things wherever you're at in the spectrum, in terms of, even if you are a dispensationalist and you're listening to this and you're not agreeing with us theologically, even if you're there, you need to have that level of compassion for folks.
Yeah, if you think about, take something totally, it's actually not that different psychologically, like more catastrophic views of climate change. I'm aware of all the same evidence as a bunch of my friends. Some of them are like, we're not going to have kids. I'm not bringing children into this world. Yeah. And I'm like, no, I'm totally going to have kids. I've got two. maybe we'll have a third. Like that, it just does not hit me that way. I think there's going to be real challenges here, and they're going to face things I didn't have to face, but it doesn't hit me viscerally on a planning my family future level the way it does for some of my other friends with the same information. So there's obviously just these other differences going on that then are interacting with that information or with these sort of theological frameworks, things like that.
We hope you're enjoying the podcast, and we want to remind you that everything we do at Determine Truth, the podcast, Rob's blog, and our YouTube channel, is available on the Determine Truth app. Directions on how to download the app is available in the show notes and on the determinetruth.com website. Just click on the app tab.
Dan, tell us a little bit about your journey from that time to the present in terms of theologically even or professionally.
Oh yeah, we can get nerdy. So in college, please. I was a philosophy major at a state school.
Okay.
That was a really intellectually and theologically tumultuous and growth heavy time because I'm popped into this. I'm a 17-year-old turning 18, just popped into this environment with some professors who were fairly supportive and had their own interesting faith lives, such as they were, and then plenty who were pretty antagonistic.
Yeah.
And then in the middle of all that, I'm having panic attacks about end time.
You still are. You still were.
I still was at that point.
Okay.
Yeah. I had my last big one probably around 29 or so years, so about 11 years ago, maybe.
Wow.
It got much better after I was about 23, 24.
Okay.
And that's when I started to learn, this is called panic disorder. This is a panic attack. And but even before then, I read a book by an amillennial author. And
it was not one of those pagans.
It was called End Times Fiction.
Okay.
And at the time I was like, this is my new view. I was an amillennialist for a while. But now I almost feel like I don't even have a position on that spectrum. But what I really appreciated, and that I later read in N.T. Wright, maybe 5 years after that, in Surprised by Hope, was this just like eviscerating takedown of the internal inconsistencies in modern dispensational hermeneutics, basically. That like they literally are speaking out of both sides of their mouth, like not literally. They're speaking out of both sides of their mouth constantly in what is figurative and what's literal, and they're having their cake and eating it too all over the place. And so that is actually low-hanging fruit. It's very psychologically interesting to me that the view of premillennial dispensationalism is so easily argued against and yet is so psychologically attractive to people. And that's why I had Danny on. You have permission amongst 3 other boomers to talk through what was that like? How was it? What was it like from 1970 to 74 when everyone knew without any evidence that Jesus was returning any day? Like, Rob, you mentioned Cold War and the Cold War era anxiety, which was totally real. And that I do think that's a piece of the puzzle. It helps me understand what was going on there. But it is so odd to me the way that fundamentalists, because these guys were all fundamentalists who really proposed this stuff. Not everybody who read them were, but all the authors were. Yeah. Right. And you guys know that better than me. And but the way that they just said, we're just going to combine that with this reading of the text, and they're so confident in their reading of the text, lo and behold, all fundamentalists are. But it's so easy to argue against it, like in an academic way. Like there's such bad theories. So that was so good for me to at least be able to go, okay, this might still have its hooks into me biologically and my fight flight system. It's in there, but intellectually it started to lose a lot of appeal as I read through that and then a little bit of other stuff later.
And that was in your college days.
Probably 19 when I read that. Yeah.
Yeah, but you're at a state school.
Yeah.
So that was just on your own studies. It wasn't part of your program or anything per se.
Rob, I don't know if you know what panic disorder is, but you tend to want to get out of it. And actually it's interesting. I am now a cognitive therapist. And so there's a lot of rich overlap with my autobiography and now what I try and help my clients learn to do, I was doing some sort of proto-cognitive therapy on my own without realizing it. I was like, let's look at the evidence for this. Let's actually dig into this and see if there's something there. And in the case of premillennial dispensationalism, I found there's not a lot there. The emperor basically has no clothes. There was one successful prediction of the reforming of the country of Israel, and that's about it. That's the only real prediction. Was that a successful prediction
or not, though?
Well,
is up
and
for
it's
debate,
also self-fulfilling prophecy to some degree.
That's right.
There are questions about how Darby actually thought that would happen. He also was super influential in the Zionist movement. Whatever. As we're recording this, Trump was assassination attempt, and he survived, and the bullet got his ear. And so a lot of people will say that must have been God protecting him. And then to that, someone could say, but God was not interested in protecting the person behind him who was killed. Exactly. It's like people will do that.
Exactly.
Yeah. But that doesn't make it a good argument.
I'm curious, as we've talked about some of the theological, some of the psychological, I can imagine someone hearing this conversation and they're hearing even the term spiritual abuse. And how do you have the conversation with someone who says the well-meaning dispensationalist, that maybe the fundamentalist, and we all know the spectrum of people who there's just the people who are just like, dude, you're not even rational. I can't even have a conversation with you. And then there's the person who it's like, dude, you're smarter than I am. This isn't about intellect right now. It's that kind of person who's like, yeah, they're compassionate and they seem reasonable, but they still hold to this view. What do you do with that person who you're not checking their integrity or their intellectual honesty, like they truly believe this, and they would say, hey, what you're calling spiritual abuse is just, and some of it might come to that certainty, but it's like, this is what God has said. I'm convinced of it. How dare we call that spiritual abuse?
I think that even people with a fundamentalist interpretation of the Bible recognize in other areas of their life that there are developmentally appropriate times for different things with their children. They don't show certain movies to their children, right? Until they're certain ages. They don't want them listening to certain things until they're certain ages. They don't teach their 9-year-olds calculus because they're not ready for it. They don't try and get them to engage in high-level theoretical debates when they're 7. The brain just takes time to develop. And what's interesting to me is I think a lot of the people who, here's my conception of the situation. They are exposing horrifying images to their children even before they believe their children are capable of sinning. So let's say you have some age of accountability theory, which of course nobody agrees on the age, but let's just say you have one and you think it's 9 or whatever it is ish. Well, a lot of these, I gave my life to Jesus at 6 and was certainly presented with some version of punishment for sin and Jesus' blood atones that sin and all this kind of thing. And so we could ask ourselves, why would someone do that if they don't even think the kid could be sinning yet?
Yeah.
And some people will give an answer like a James Dobson type of an answer, which is the sinful will shows up in children, which I think is just astonishingly ignorant for someone with his level of education about the development of the brain. He and others like him either ignore or I don't understand what's going on with understanding that like children are fully egocentric till they're about 6 or 7. They just can't. That's all they can do. If they were a dolphin, they would still be in their mother's womb at that point. That's not quite true. I'm exaggerating. But, we get born early as humans compared to other animals. And because of our big brains. Anyway, so I'm having a moment here.
Vinny and I have them every single week on the podcast. It takes a lot of editing to do with 2 ADD guys on it. So you're good. You're in good company right now.
I'm gonna connect it. It'll sound better in the edit.
Hopefully.
So my conceptualization of what's going on there is that if a parent genuinely believes that there is a non-zero chance that their child is going to go to hell for eternity, then the number one anxiety in their mind and body that they need to quell is that will happen. And once that's covered, everything else is less important, is not quite icing on the cake, not quite gravy, but that's the ultimate fear. And I think that's the motivation for introducing stuff at a developmentally inappropriate age, is actually to reduce the parents' fear, anxiety, deep dread that they might be separated from their child for all of eternity.
Yeah.
And so at that point, anything goes, whatever it takes. There's literally nothing more important than that. So we're going to get that box checked. And our church is full of other people who feel the exact same way about their children, or they used to feel that way about their children, or they will feel that way about their children when they have them. So we will not have trouble collectively building structures that make sense of that, going for these very early decisions of faith and making sure that children understand that they are fundamentally sinful among the very first things we teach them. The Jesus Storybook Bible is a good example of this. And it's almost like you can, if you have the right lens, you can feel the anxiety coming off the pages of that thing. Everything has to lead to a kid like coming to a saving knowledge of Christ, because that's it. That's everything in that world.
Right.
Yeah. That's the world I grew up in completely. It was a lot of, I grew up in a Baptist church in the South, was very revivalistic. There was an invitation after every service that we had. Enormous amount of pressure. I walked the aisle, if you want to say, the first time when I was 7 years old, and that was at a revival meeting. We have had those weekly revival meetings. That's the whole culture I grew up in. There was an enormous amount of pressure to make that decision.
That's not all bad. I
didn't experience it all bad. To be honest with you,
I didn't experience mine bad either, of accepting Christ at 6 or whatever. Like, it's a type of a coming of age ritual. Think Catholic Church, and you've got confirmation, and you got First Communion. That stuff. Like, I don't have, in principle, any issue with like regular age appropriate rites of passage that are supported by the adults in a multi-generational faith context. I think that's actually quite healthy. It's just, we could think a little bit about when our children should know what. And are we just, if we are potentially harming our kids to make our own anxiety go down, we have examples of, we all know of parents that do things like that, and we don't want to be that kind of parent, but we just might not recognize that we're doing it in a faith context.
I'm curious, Dan, just to broaden out the conversation a little bit to some of your research. You talk a lot about your own experience, particularly a lot of in your high school and young up to college, young adult years with these anxiety around this topic. Is your research shown that that's fairly broad around this particular issue of end time stuff? How isolated was it? How far and wide have you found that to be an issue among people psychologically and spiritually?
Yeah, I'll just tread lightly around quantitative stuff, because I have not yet, for instance, I'd love to do this, and we'll probably apply for grant money to do it at some point. I'd love to give the spiritual abuse scale to a nationally representative sample, for instance, of Americans, Canadians, maybe do it in the UK, Australia, something like that, to get a kind of a sense, but no one's done that yet. Really, not to my satisfaction. And so those numbers are a little bit elusive. In terms of end time stuff, like a couple broad findings I think are pretty solid. Number one, it's a bigger deal in Protestantism than Catholicism, right? And it's basically any churches that were connected to the 90s, 80s on, the sort of from the 80s on, a little bit in the mid 70s, these parallel evangelical cultural institutions that we got our own music, we've got our own movies, we have our own radio stations, we have our own television channels. You can live an entire American life. It's harder now, but especially pre everybody having smartphones, you could live your entire American life within an evangelical subcultural bubble, essentially.
Absolutely.
And not a bubble is too soft of a word for it. It was like a metropolis would be a better word than a bubble. Like you really could, especially if you're in the Midwest or the South. And I would say that I would feel confident saying that any church traditions that were connected to that mega infrastructure, this was part of the water. The Left Behind books have sold, I don't have the
80 or 90 million.
Yeah, 80 or 90 for a book. Do you know how insane that is for books?
It's just a little bit more than my books have sold, but
a little bit more than yours are. These are Twilight numbers. These are just huge numbers. Not quite Harry Potter numbers, but these are massive numbers.
Right.
And when you consider that evangelicals at our most, we were ever only about 30% of the U.S. population.
Right.
And those are mostly the people who are buying those books. I mean, you're talking 90 million books sold to a population of approximately 50 million people. So do the math. And then, of course, there are 12 they kept adding. They turned, just like with the Hobbit trilogy, they did the old Peter Jackson, let's turn this last book into 3 books. Of course, who can blame them? Capitalists that we all are. But so huge. I'm comfortable saying those things. I'm dodgy on what percentage of people have been abused, or we don't really know.
No.
Yeah.
I just was curious in your own, what you found and observed in other people besides your own story in that regard.
Like the joke I made earlier, if you don't have a story of wondering if everybody else was raptured, then you weren't raised evangelical. That's a joke, but I would almost stand by that mathematically.
Very interesting.
My Southern Baptist church, we were so confident in our salvation that actually I don't know that ever broached our congregation. But so I did grow up in that world.
You should ask, I'd be curious, and you should email me, ask a bunch of your friends you grew up going to church with and see how many of them, because I think it's not a big jump, especially for a child to make. Not totally good on all the details or whatever.
I think, Dan, you may remember from our conversation several years ago over this, I grew up in a Baptist church, had the 7-year-old walk the aisle thing. I went through an angsty period over faith in my high school years, and it was the summer before college that I would look back and say, this is my firmest commitment to become a follower of Jesus. That's right. And almost immediately, Late Great Planet Earth explodes. Hal Lindsey stuff. It's the Atlanta version of the Jesus movement. It's the end time stuff, the music associated with it. We've talked about the music, Dan, in the past. The music associated with it.
Stuff in there. Yeah.
We've all been ready.
That one's not one of them, but there are some great songs. I'll take I'm Forgiven by the Imperials any day.
There you go. Over Larry Norman.
Some Larry Norman slaps. Yeah, absolutely.
I went to a Larry Norman concert in college. That's all I can say.
But it was talked about incessantly in my culture, my church culture, and it was all over the place. We ate that stuff up. The very first Bible I ever bought was when I was during that era was a Schofield Reference Bible. That's what people told me I needed to buy. We ate and drank that stuff in the early 70s. Mm-hmm. So I was just completely, literally and figuratively baptized in the middle of all that. Yeah, it was a defining thing. And it wasn't until I actually went away to college to a fairly conservative, very conservative Bible college that did have a different eschatological perspective and forced us to read different perspectives that I said, maybe there's a different way to think about this. Yeah. And that started my own journey toward a different view of all this. But it was, like you said, it was ubiquitous in that early 70s culture.
One psychological angle that I think is helpful here that kind of ties into what we've been talking about is if you're trying to preach to a bunch of young people and you want them to really understand the stakes, and you think the stakes are heaven and hell, okay, you've got a few options, because even if you're not a developmental psychologist, we all know once we get old enough that teenagers are not very good about thinking about the future. And now we have really good sort of cognitive and neurological language for why that is. You know, it's their prefrontal cortex is not as connected, doesn't fully connect for males until their late 20s, females to their mid 20s. And so you've got this real inability to think into the future. And this is part of what makes teenagers reckless at a neurological level. And so if you're trying to say, yeah, but you guys, you don't understand, the fires of hell await you and every one of your friends that does not know the Lord. This is the reality. This is, frankly, the only thing that really matters in your life. but we're having a really hard time convincing you to take this seriously because you're 16.
Mm-hmm.
Now you have options. You can do hell houses. And at the hell house, you have to think, how do we get 16-year-olds to die? I know, alcohol poisoning, drunk drivers, stuff like that. These are options you have for like making it clear to a young person that the stakes are high. But not that many people die from drunk drivers, and not that many people die from alcohol poisoning occasionally. Before the opioid epidemic, that would be a more effective strategy if I were a evangelical youth pastor today. Perhaps what would really get everybody on the hook psychologically to understand the stake, Jesus coming back any moment. Because now it doesn't matter how old you are. It's not about that you're going to get a cancer diagnosis. This is not hospice ministry. This is true of anybody. It doesn't matter how old you are. That's why I was given the book when I was 11, because some thought that this is coming, and so I will protect this kid in some way. And so there is a real sort of like have you guys heard, like, neurologists will talk about how we have a receptor that the opium molecule like fits perfectly into, and that's why opiates are so effective. Like we have different neurotransmitters.
So addictive, you mean?
Yeah, effective and addictive. They're addictive because they're so effective. They like fit our brains really well for some reason, in a way that, like, I don't know, whatever the neurotransmitter that ibuprofen gives you it still works, but it doesn't. Someone with a brain science background is going to be shaking their heads. Anyway, the idea is just we have this we have an opiate receptor basically already built into our brains. So if you get an opium product, it hits really strong. It's a very effective chemical tool. That's how I think about the imminence of the return of Christ. It is this extremely effective and convenient teaching that we're not going to scrutinize too much because it does too much for us. It gets butts in seats. It gets souls in the kingdom. And
it gets money in the plate.
And money in the plate because it raises the stakes.
Yep.
And so I think we're really disincentivized to look more closely at it if we have a higher and more certain belief in the reality of heaven and hell, sheep and goats, wheat and chaff. Because then we'll just think, look, okay, maybe we're a little bit wrong about the details, but that doesn't matter. People are going to hell, and this is keeping them from going to hell. What are you talking about?
Fantastic. Dan, thank you so much. Vinny and I have actually, behind the scenes, been trying to work for, Vinny, almost 2 years now, trying to get some conversations on mental health, because it's a reality that hits us, and it's a good conversation. Obviously, tying it into this conversation is very helpful.
Dan, thanks so much for spending time with us today and offering I want to say, Rob, normally we have scholars on, like theological scholars, biblical scholars.
No, we have scholars on. This week we had Dan.
No, but
that just didn't sound right, Vinny. Try that again. Take two.
In case you haven't let me finish. There's been a couple times we've had practitioners on, but this is the first time we've had someone outside of the realm of theology altogether, but it is speaking from a significant experience level. I think it's just fascinating on so many levels. So thanks, Dan, so much.
Thank you. I appreciate it. I'm more of a theological hobbyist and then an actual licensed therapist.
Excellent.
Nice.
Appreciate it.
Yeah. All right, everyone. Hope you guys enjoyed this. We will link to whatever we can for Dan's work. And well, good luck on all your research and what you're doing. And maybe we'll catch up again some other time.
Thanks so much.
Yeah.
All right, bud. All right, everyone. See you guys later.
No, Vinny, we won't see them. It's a podcast, Vinny. We don't see anybody.
I want to thank you for joining us on today's podcast, and we would love for you to share the work of Determined Truth with others. Please follow this podcast and give a review on iTunes, Spotify, or wherever you get your podcasts. Your review will go a long way towards helping others find this podcast. Then share it with others so that we can get the word of the gospel of the kingdom to more people.